A couple of months ago, when we first got an email from Michael Burlingame that Nigel Hamilton was going to be our speaker, I was very excited because I knew who this gentleman was. And I immediately pulled out my phone and pulled out my Amazon app and saw this long list of very scholarly books, very important things he was writing about, and this definitive biographies of people. But then I realized that Nigel is in a very select and distinctive group of historians and people who write biographies about the important men and women in history. One volume will not do. Multiple volumes. Like Dr. Burlingame's The Green Monster, which he reminded me today is actually 2 volumes that there should be 4. And so he smushed together the 2 volumes into going from 4 down to 2. And when I looked at the long list of books that Nigel Hamilton has written, I noticed that he wrote the definitive history of Franklin Roosevelt in World War II as a war leader, 3 volumes. I also saw they had written a biography of Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, 3 volumes. And that is true of some of the other books he's written. He's also written a book about writing biographies. And so I think we have an extraordinarily interesting talk tonight. Nigel will be publishing a book about Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, comparing those 2 as world leaders. That's a few months off yet. And so tonight we have a very special presentation, an original presentation, not done anywhere else until now, which is talking about President Roosevelt and President Lincoln as war leaders in World War II and the Civil War, respectively, of course. So, Nigel, the dais is yours.
Thank you, Bill, and good evening, everybody. I don't know how many British accents you get to hear at these conventions, and I apologize for mine, but I feel very honored to have been invited to talk to you tonight and to visit for the first time Springfield on the anniversary, or almost the anniversary, of President Lincoln's birth. And at a moment when, sadly, our country, as I'm now an American citizen, is facing many of the same issues that confronted the 15th president 163 years ago. At the beginning of my new book, Lincoln versus Davis, The War of the Presidents, President Lincoln sets off from Springfield for his inauguration in Washington prior to a civil war he will wage against his opponent, Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who was simultaneously setting off from Vicksburg to his own inauguration in Montgomery. So it's been a thrill for me and my wife, Raynell, to visit the place where that contest between 2 American presidents really began. Even to see, as I was shown this morning, shown by the Illinois State historian Mark Johnson, the very station from which President Lincoln departed all those years ago. Tonight, though, I'm going to talk briefly about another lineup, so to speak, a look at Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln, the greatest American president of the 20th century and the greatest of the 19th century. And I'm going to talk about them as presidents and, above all, commanders-in-chief in war. I began my career as a military historian over 40 years ago with my 3-volume Monty, which Bill referenced. I had grown up in England, and my father had served under Field Marshal Montgomery He'd been evacuated from Dunkirk at the age of 21, and he went back to France on D-Day as the commander of a British battalion of 1,000 men. Only 600 of whom survived the Battle of Normandy. And he was serving under Field Marshal Montgomery. He was decorated with a DSO near Nijmegen. And as a child, we camped in France near the Normandy beaches. He introduced me. He became a very prominent British newspaper editor, the Sunday Times, and published Montgomery's memoirs, very controversial memoirs, in which Monty claimed he could have won the war in 1944, and really pissed off President I'm struggling. Eisenhower. Sorry. So I was introduced to Field Marshal Montgomery when I was a kid. I began to spend vacations with the Field Marshal, who was very lonely, lived at an old mill south of London, and one weekend Monty took me to stay with Winston Churchill. So it was my privilege to sit to the right side of and opposite the two greatest war leaders that Britain had in World War II. And I am ashamed to say that I did not appreciate the significance of this extraordinary experience until more recently, over recent years, when I tell people and they say, "Oh my God, don't you realize?" And I think it's true that I am the last person outside of the Churchill family to have stayed with the former British Prime Minister. More recently, I wrote a 3-volume biography of Field Marshal Montgomery, Monty. It was published in the United States, and if you go down to the Prairie Archives bookstore in Springfield, they have a beautifully jacketed, signed copies of the trilogy to buy. More recently, beginning in 2009, I spent 10 years of my life studying and narrating the life of Franklin Roosevelt at war in 3 volumes: The Mantle of Command, Commander-in-Chief, and War and Peace. And now, over the last 3 years, studying the life and performance of Abraham Lincoln in the same role as U.S. Commander-in-Chief. Comparing Presidents Roosevelt and Lincoln as Commanders-in-Chief at war is not something that's... Michael said to me, "Nigel, if you will come to Springfield and speak to the ALA, you may speak about any topic you choose." And I thought, as I've spent so many years studying President Roosevelt at war, and now 3 years studying President Lincoln at war, that I would like to compare them. And so far as I know, there has never been a serious study, a comparative study of these 2 great presidents as commanders-in-chief. And so I'm hoping that my few words will yield some interesting observations, even insights into the business of great leadership and command. Most of all, though, I hope it'll help us to see them better as human beings facing almost unbelievably difficult challenges in war, for good or ill. When I set about preparing this address, my mind went back to the literary hero in the field of biography, indeed the very founder of biography as we know it today in the West, the Greco-Roman philosopher and historian Plutarch, who almost 2,000 years ago wrote a classic series of essays he called Parallel Lives, looking at pairs of Greek and Roman figures of the past, first summarizing each of their lives and finally undertaking a comparison between them, men like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, Agesilaus and Pompey, Demosthenes and Cicero, spellbindingly human portraits in prose even today. Let's go then tonight on our own Plutarchian journey into the past and look at Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln, the patrician and the rail splitter, the son of privilege and the son of a pioneer farmer, the Groton and Harvard graduate and the virtually self-educated young man, the one an inheritor of great wealth and land, the other living on his income as a hard-working lawyer, the one who loved the sea, in fact whose intended career in the Navy was denied by his mother, couldn't bear the idea of Franklin leaving her. The other who had only been down the waters of the Mississippi River on a flatboat. But both men tall, over 6'4", and in their 50s when war came for the United States and for them as US presidents. Both men operating as commanders-in-chief from the same White House on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington. The one paralyzed by polio from the waist down, however, and in a wheeled chair. The other able to vault a 3-foot-high counter when thinking his son had lost the draft of his first inauguration speech. Let's start this parallel portrait of wartime presidents and commanders-in-chief, then, with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the great deceiver, one might call him, a man given to secrecy and deceptiveness, a man who said his left hand did not even know what his right hand would do, a man who fell deeply in love with his wife's young, beautiful social secretary, Lucy Mercer, and managed to pull the proverbial wool over his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt's eyes for years until Eleanor found Lucy's perfumed love letters in Franklin's valise on his return from the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919. That was, I think, a pattern of deception that Franklin Roosevelt would pursue his whole life, literally to the end. A man who would have married Lucy, but for the fact that his mother, again, Sarah, who controlled the Roosevelt estate, threatened to disinherit him if he did. A man felled by poliomyelitis who became a traitor to his class as a Democrat, a governor of New York State, and set about saving the United States faced by the Great Depression, winning election as 32nd president once, then twice, and then an unprecedented third time in 1940. With war threatening in Europe and the Far East, this was not only Winston Churchill's, but Roosevelt's finest hour, as Roosevelt first braced the nation for war and then became not only the United States commander-in-chief in war, but commander-in-chief of the Western Allies, the 26 countries he called in 1941 the United Nations. To prevail in that war against the Axis powers, he felt he had to use his talent for deception to the ultimate. To defeat the totalitarian dictators by every stratagem of surprise, obfuscation, and duplicity possible, while maintaining and being wedded to the principles of democracy and justice at home and with his allies. When Churchill crossed the Atlantic to meet FDR in 1941, pleading for the United States to enter the war against Hitler on Britain's side, FDR sent the British leader home instead with the Atlantic Charter, committing the British Empire to the independence of its colonies after the war. He had won his third election on the promise that American boys would not be sent to fight foreign wars, but in reality he began mobilizing the nation economically and militarily. Immediately he won re-election. And when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and Hitler also declared war on the United States 4 days later, Roosevelt found himself in his element at the White House. He dismissed the failed, such as Admirals Kimmel and Stark, and promoted those who were effective irrespective of party. As his Secretaries of War and Navy, he appointed Republicans, Henry Stimson and Frank Knox. Moreover, he laid down the strategy of a vast two-ocean war from the word go, explaining that Germany had to be defeated first, since Japan would be unable to pursue their war of aggression across Asia and the Pacific once Germany fell, whereas Nazi Germany might well survive even if Japan fell. When Roosevelt's military chiefs of staff ganged up and tried to force him to authorize a D-Day evasion in 1942 before a single American had fired a single shot at a single German, Roosevelt overrode the chiefs peremptorily as commander-in-chief. Instead, he insisted the United States must gain a stepping stone to Europe by invading Northwest Africa, where there were no Germans, namely Algeria and Morocco, the famous Torch invasion, and promoted young Dwight Eisenhower to command it, thereby allowing American forces to learn the lessons of modern war, especially aerial warfare, as they did so, which they did at Kasserine, then Tunis, then Sicily and southern Italy, from which US bombers could reach southern Germany. And all the while, Roosevelt directing the strategy of the war and appointing successful commanders, MacArthur, Nimitz, Patton, Arnold, to accomplish it. Sending brave Jimmy Doolittle's flight of B-25s to launch a secret attack on Tokyo from a base which FDR called Shangri-La, namely a US aircraft carrier operating incognito in the Pacific. Even using secret decrypts of Japanese military communications to authorize the almost incredible interception and killing of the mastermind behind the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Admiral Yamamoto. We haven't time on our brief Plutarchian journey tonight to follow FDR's performance as commander-in-chief any further, but I would go so far as to say, and I did spend 10 years investigating this, it was nothing short of miraculous how this one man, a paraplegic, working from his Oval Office in the White House with telephone and telegrams and a map and communications room in a former closet, a lady's closet downstairs, was able to mastermind and direct the Second World War, far outclassing the performance of Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who would have cancelled D-Day in 1942 if FDR had not deceived and outwitted Churchill's attempt to sabotage Allied policy in order to preserve British manpower to man the British colonial empire. There were, of course, principles Roosevelt simply ignored, such as the internment of Japanese Americans after Pearl Harbor, and compromises he gave way to, but through his many hundreds of press conferences, his fireside radio chats, his inspections of industrial war plants at home, and his visits by air and sea to the battlefields of North Africa and the Pacific as Commander-in-Chief, a paraplegic, to meet with his field commanders and speak with American troops, sailors, and airmen. Roosevelt not only assured unity amongst Americans at home and abroad in waging the war, but laid down an unequivocal Allied policy of unconditional surrender at Casablanca in January 1943, lest there ever be a return to the rise of the dictators as it happened in Europe after World War I. Unlike the British Prime Minister, who ignored the question of post-war social and economic change, Roosevelt also announced proposals for a second Bill of Rights for America, and got even Stalin to agree to set up a post-war United Nations Assembly and Security Council to preserve international peace, one that would prove vastly more effective than the League of Nations that had failed after World War I. How then does President Abraham Lincoln, 16th United States President, compare with his later successor, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 32nd President, in the role of Commander-in-Chief in war? As we celebrate the recent 215th anniversary of Lincoln's birth in Kentucky, I don't wish to be guilty of lèse-majesté or even blasphemy, given Lincoln's abiding status in our country's history. Biographers in the Western world, however, have, since Plutarch, Suetonius, and other classical authors, attempted to tell the truth as they see it, as best they see it, chronicling and judging the lives of real individuals, at least once they're deceased and cannot sue for libel. The truthful biographer of Lincoln must report, then, that if he or she is to be honest, Lincoln does not really compare in performance with FDR as United States Commander-in-Chief in war. The fact is, Roosevelt already had more than 8 years of experience in the Oval Office when World War II began for the United States, and decades of administrative experience dealing with colleagues and subordinates. FDR's deceptiveness, his charm-filled deceptiveness, allowed him to control others and bend them to his dominating will with astonishing effectiveness. He proved himself a master politician, a master strategist, and a master in commanding the generals who had to carry out his military policies. Abraham Lincoln, by contrast, was named Honest Abe for the very reason that he was not a deceiver, was possibly the most honest, undeceiving individual ever to lead a great nation in war. On becoming president, Lincoln had zero executive or administrative experience. And though smarter probably than almost any man of his time, smarts do not a war wage effectively. He had not Roosevelt's ability to fire people, since he hated personal confrontation or even indirect confrontation. Lincoln liked consensus and had initially, as president and commander-in-chief, no more ability to take and stand by a decision than his predecessor, President Buchanan. Where Roosevelt never lost a night's sleep worrying and perseverating over decisions, Lincoln tossed, turned, worried, and wearied. His cabinet ministers were thus forced to try and prop him up psychologically, or seek to depose or reduce him down to a figurehead, as William Seward, the Secretary of State, attempted. Seward first plotting a coup d'etat, then sabotaging Lincoln's military efforts as commander-in-chief, and generally being, in my view, as treasonous as any individual official, especially a Secretary of State, could possibly be, and getting away with it. For Abraham Lincoln found it impossible within himself to fire Seward. The same proved true with another individual Lincoln unhappily appointed and promoted, the little Napoleon, or would-be Napoleon, the 34-year-old Captain George Brinton McClellan, we've heard quite a lot about today, who was even more treasonous, in my view, than Seward. The story of how Lincoln appointed McClellan, made him U.S., as he called it, U.S. Supreme Commander, despite McClellan being a pro-slavery Northerner, and of how he then tolerated McClellan's repeated insubordination, would be the stuff of comedy, and is comedy in my new book. Were it not so tragic, Lincoln, in due course, inveigled by little General McClellan, half his size, and almost half his age, Lincoln authorizing McClellan, even though Lincoln was commander-in-chief, United States commander-in-chief, authorizing McClellan to undertake an amphibious landing and campaign hundreds of miles away on the Virginian Peninsula that Lincoln himself didn't want or believe in or thought would even work, but didn't have the self-confidence to say no to. Or even to fire the imbecile, who had in the meantime made himself a kind of charismatic rival for power on behalf of Union generals and their backers, political, financial, media backers. A failure on Abraham Lincoln's part as U.S. Commander-in-Chief that led to America's own Dunkirk, where, when the largest army the United States had ever fielded in war, more than 135,000 men, had to be evacuated, largely without their equipment, from a narrow beachhead, Harrison's Landing. My wife and I went there last January, a year ago, on the James River in the summer of 1862, following McClellan's defeat and retreat on the Virginian Peninsula. A defeat at the hands of General Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Commander-in-Chief, President Jefferson Davis, that might well have ended Lincoln's attempt to end the armed insurrection of the South. Comparing Roosevelt and Lincoln as commanders-in-chief, then, seems a zero-sum game, at least for the honest biographer, since the historian cannot make out of the lawyer from Springfield a commanding genius on the Olympian scale of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The biographer, however, deals in other coin than mere comparative talent and performance in an historic military role. After 10 years of research and writing, I felt I'd come to understand and appreciate the performance of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, at least in his war role, but had also come to know him better as a person, a human being, his character. And though I admired FDR more than ever for what he achieved as President and Commander-in-Chief, and though I felt compassion for his physical disability and his courage in overcoming it, Roosevelt still remained elusive, impossible to quite pin down, like a superlative actor who's a wonderful in his role, but who remains at heart an enigma. Plutarch once wrote how, as a biographer, writing in his retirement at his home in Greece, he came to see his subjects, when he researched their biographies and sought to narrate their lives, as, quote, guests in his home, guests who caused him, almost in the manner of a priest, to examine their souls, their moral worth as individuals. I'm going to get emotional, so bear with me. I have lived with Abraham Lincoln and Mary Lincoln for the past 3 years as my house guests. I have come to see and appreciate them more and more for their humanness than I ever came to see Franklin Roosevelt. Mary's weaknesses, her difficult mental health, and Abraham's weaknesses when dealing as he had to with domineering, angrier, more deceitful colleagues and subordinates, these only make me feel the closer, the more appreciative of them both as my guests in my house. Mary's family in Kentucky, a Union state after all, supports and even fights for the states that her family fought for the Confederate insurrection and rebellion. By contrast, Mary herself remained loyal to the Union and even helps her companion, Elizabeth Keckley, a former enslaved woman of color, to help destitute fugitive slaves in New York. And Abraham worries he will lose the slave-holding states, border states. He fantasizes for a long time that colonization, exporting people of color from America, will solve the problem of the war. Is ravaged by anxiety as to how he can possibly win the war without having to tackle slavery. And in the end, is only released from his crisis, his trauma, by his opponent's blunder in invading the North after their defeat of McClellan's army on the Virginian Peninsula and the issuing of their mad proclamation of liberation in Maryland. For that is when Abraham Lincoln's essential character, his moral fiber, if you will, finally comes to the fore. Recognizing he is not a very good commander-in-chief, he feels he is nevertheless a man of principle, and summoning at last his courage, he uses his enemy's stupid mistake to do what his conscience dictates, martial law permits, and his political genius can make happen. He tells his treasonous pro-slaver Secretary of State to shut up and brings his cabinet behind him in issuing, as Commander-in-Chief, the document that will end slavery in the South as a military necessity. He knows it may well lead to his own death. But after a year and a half of war, he knows he must do it. Moreover, can do it in a way that perhaps no other American can, for his integrity, his honesty, his lack of deceitfulness, his faith in goodness, democracy, and humanity are his credentials. For all his vacillation, his lack of commanding confidence and personality, his qualms as a lawyer, Lincoln's decision as Commander-in-Chief to issue his counter-proclamation on military grounds 2 weeks after President Davis and General Lee's mad invasion and Confederate proclamations in the fall of 1862. An emancipation proclamation that doomed the armed rebellion of the South by ensuring that the European powers, Britain, France, Spain, Austria, Russia, would never dare recognize the rebellion or break his blockade after that Emancipation Proclamation as a casus belli, the reason for the war. That places him surely in the same rank as Franklin Roosevelt, who confronted the Nazi policy of totalen Krieg with similarly profound moral courage, beginning with the Atlantic Charter and ending with the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany, followed by Japan. 2 American presidents, 2 wartime commanders-in-chief it has been my privilege to receive as house guests these past 13 years, and whose memory I have the greatest pride with you in honoring tonight. Thank you.